We've heard it all before, haven't we? The Catholic Church is the enemy of science, progress, and reason. Well, it's all nonsense, and we're going to debunk it mercilessly. Join me right now for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm your host, Thomas Woods. I'd like to begin this 13-program series with a fact that's fairly obvious to most of us. There's a bit of a double standard in the world when it comes to the Catholic Church. You can say anything you like about the Catholic Church, your career won't be over, no one will care, there'll be no candlelight vigils or hunger strikes. You say anything you like about it, and that's just fine. If anything, you'll be even more welcome in fashionable circles than before. So, what's the result of that? The result is that you can get away with saying the most absurd, ludicrous things about the Catholic Church, and people believe it. People are inclined to believe every ridiculous calumny against the Catholic Church, but worse still, some Catholics themselves, I think, have begun to interiorize some of these criticisms, and deep down, I think they themselves wonder, has the Church really been a positive influence in history, after all? Hasn't she been responsible only for repression and ignorance? And hasn't she been an opponent of the sciences? We've all been taught to believe this. It would be a miracle if people didn't believe it. But it's not true. And in this series we're going to show why it's not true, and we're going to show the true glory of the Catholic Church. Now, the attacks on the Catholic Church and on religious belief in general have accelerated just over the past 5 years or so. We've already seen in recent years, best-selling books by Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, condemning religious belief in general as irrational and foolish, and in effect they're saying to children in this country, your parents are stupid for teaching you the faith. Worse than that is that after the July 7th, 2005 bombings in London, what we began to see is this trend, that Islamic terrorism is now giving intellectuals an excuse to oppose all religion. The argument being that all religion is irrational, all religion can give rise to violence, so it should all be condemned. So, for example, in Scotland's Sunday Herald, we read Muriel Gray saying, "The cause of all this misery, mayhem, violence, terror, and ignorance is, of course, religion itself." And she called religion Dark Ages nonsense. For the government of a secular country such as ours, she said, to treat religion as if it had real merit, instead of regarding it as a ridiculous anachronism, which education, wisdom, and experience can hopefully overcome in time, is one of the most depressing developments of the 21st century. Now, I'll leave aside the fact that she doesn't know how to use the word hopefully correctly. That's another matter. The point is, this is our critic. Another critic, Polly Toynbee in the London Guardian, said, "It is now time to get serious about all religion and draw a firm line between the real world and the world of dreams." In the London Spectator, Matthew Paris said, "What unites an extremist mullah with a Catholic priest or evangelical Protestant minister is actually much more significant and interesting than what divides him from them." Well, these criticisms have become routine. Day in and day out we hear them. All religion is the enemy of progress. But the Catholic Church in particular is consistently viewed as the enemy of science and progress and knowledge. Consistently. Now, why is that? How did that happen? In part, it began 200 years ago or more in the so-called Enlightenment, which was a period in 18th century European history in which the intellectual classes became extraordinarily hostile to the Church. They disparaged the Middle Ages consistently. In fact, that's why they had the word Enlightenment. Because the idea was that before the Enlightenment, before the wonderful 18th century, all we had was misery and backwardness and ignorance fostered by the Catholic Church. But now, thankfully, we have secular intellectuals to bring us enlightenment. I sometimes think that the most depressing job on earth must be to be a history professor who teaches about the Middle Ages. It must be the most depressing job on earth. All day long, you lecture about the Middle Ages, and you say, the Middle Ages weren't so bad. In fact, a lot of great things happened in the Middle Ages. Catholic Church made a lot of great things possible. You lecture on this all day long. You write books and articles on it. You even appear on television. You appear on radio, and you talk about it. And what happens? You get home at night, you turn on the TV, nothing you've done has made any effect. Everybody still believes the Middle Ages was a time of ignorance and repression, and it was all the fault of the Catholic Church. All of that stuff, in effect, cannot be dislodged. It must be extremely depressing. Now, why are these falsehoods so resistant to the truth? Why is it so hard to get people to change their minds on this? Well, ever since the Enlightenment, what has taken root in our culture and in our way of thinking is that the Catholic Church is assumed to be wrong, and that secularism, that is the idea of organizing society and all of life without reference to God, that is said to be the source of progress. So by definition, anything the Church is connected to involves retrogression. Whereas anything that a secular intellectual brings us, well, that brings us progress. And that has been the lens through which history has been viewed over the past 200 years. That's why it's only over the past maybe 50 years that we've begun to see historians finally cracking through this nonsense and finally saying, wait a minute, not only did the Catholic Church not obstruct the sciences, she may have helped to foster them. Not only did secularists not invent the science of economics, for example, but in fact it turns out it was Catholic priests and professors who developed the ideas of economics centuries earlier, and on and on and on. But it's taken a long time to crack through this accepted idea that the Church is responsible for retrogression and ignorance. It's taken forever. Now let's think about some of these areas in which the Catholic Church has really built our civilization. I mean, I choose that word advisedly. Why is it that the Catholic Church can be said to be her builder? Well, for example, consider how we think about charity, charitable work. We think that you're engaged in charity when you help somebody without any expectation of a reward, when you do it because it's good and it's right to do it. You do it because you know that in the grand scheme of things, that unfortunate person is in some sense your equal, having been made in the image and likeness of God, and so you help that person. You don't help that person because you expect 3 years down the road to revisit him and say, remember that $15 I gave you, why don't you cough it up? Or to revisit him and say, I need votes, I need some political support, why don't you come help me? We don't do it so we can tell the whole world, hey, look at what a great guy I am, I just gave that guy $10. We don't do it for those reasons. We do it for the reasons that I gave, purely disinterested motives. Well, where do we get that idea? That idea comes from the Catholic Church. Because in ancient Greece or Rome, if you had said, oh, I'm going to go help somebody with no expectation of any reciprocity, I'm just going to go do it out of the goodness of my heart, they would have thought you were crazy. What are you talking about, man? Much less the idea that I would pray for and even try to help my own enemies. What, are you insane? But yet today, we take this for granted as the ideal, that the good man tries to observe these principles. But again, where do they come from? They come from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church teaches this about charity. The ancient world didn't. So here's an area in which things that we take for granted, this is the way we think, we take it for granted. Where does that come from? It comes from the Catholic Church. We'll have more to say about that in a future episode. How about the idea of rights, that I have a right to own property, or a right not to be killed, for example? Where does that idea of rights come from? Well, we've always been told that secularists in the Enlightenment, or just before the Enlightenment, came up with this idea. In the 17th century, all of a sudden, boom, rights just developed. Well, that's not true either. And once again, modern research is coming to the rescue of Catholicism. I know that sounds odd. You think modern researchers, you want to run the other way. But in fact, honest professors, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, are now saying that the idea of rights goes all the way back to the 12th century and Catholic canon lawyers who gave the idea its birth. And the idea of a right simply means that I have a certain immunity to invasion by you. You can't just arbitrarily kill me or deprive me of my property, things of this nature. That's all a right is, that it would be wrong for you to interfere with me in these areas. And where does this liberating idea come from? From the heart of the Church. Or again, economic science. Did Adam Smith just think of economics in the 18th century? It all just came out of his head. He had this gigantic head, and all of economics just poured out of it. No. In fact, for the past 50 years, what have historians been saying? They've been saying that it was the Catholic scholastics, professors who taught in particularly Spanish universities, and specifically the University of Salamanca, that gave birth to modern economics. They were the founders of economics, not secularists of the Enlightenment. This is now being discovered. On the wall of my office, I have a framed picture of the University of Salamanca. Now, most people would come in and say, "What's the matter with you, man? Why would you, of all universities, pick this one?" It's because I know that this is where economics was given birth. And if you're a geek like me, you're very interested in and you love economics. But then finally, for right now, before our break, what about our commitment to reason? Don't we always pride ourselves in Western civilization on our commitment to the use of reason? That we use human reason to resolve disputes and to settle debates? Well, of course. But where does that come from? Where does that come from? That also comes from the Catholic Church. Why? Because the university system that the Catholic Church fostered encouraged debate, rigorous debate. And human reason was held up as the great arbiter to decide all these matters that are up for debate. Again, isn't that the opposite of what you're told? What we're told is that the Catholic Church is an enemy of reason. To the contrary, there has been no greater champion of reason. But it's not just reason. It's more specific applications of reason. For example, the sciences in particular. The sciences, more than we realize, owe themselves to the Catholic Church. Now, why is that? It's the opposite of what we're told, but believe it or not, historians of the past 50 years have begun to say the Catholic Church is more and more responsible for the sciences. Come on back and we'll talk about this after the break. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Before the break, we were talking about all these areas in which the Catholic contribution to our civilization has been indispensable, but in which it's largely neglected. How many of the facts that we've uncovered even up to now are covered in schools on a regular basis? Do I even have to ask that question? But I teased you a little bit with the idea of the Catholic Church as having helped to give birth to science in Western civilization just before our break here. What did I mean by that? Well, I'm going to tease you a little bit again, because by next time we're going to get into the sciences in real depth, the next 3 episodes, in fact, because here I think we have the aspect of Catholic history that is most often mangled and distorted, and most often used, I think, as a bludgeon with which to beat the Church over the head. And I want to show that this is largely without merit. What I at least want to tell you for now is that it really is true that over the past 50 years, scientists who write the history of science have begun rethinking the old arguments against the Church and said, you know what, on second thought, the Church actually did very important things. There's a reason that science took root and then was sustained for so long in Western civilization, whereas it wasn't in others. And this, it turns out, is not in spite of the Catholic Church, but in some ways because of it. Now, 100 years ago, it's true, you would have read a book by Andrew Dixon White called, that refers to the alleged warfare between religion and science in Western civilization. Today, White's book is considered almost laughable among professors. It's so out of date and so ludicrous. Today, you have professors like Edward Grant writing Cambridge University Press books. You've got Thomas Goldstein, A.C. Crombie, David Lindbergh, and many besides. And what they all agree on is that you can't just say the Church was an opponent of the sciences. To the contrary, there were aspects of Catholic thinking that were indispensable for the development of science. And we're going to get into specifically what were those. But right now, I want you to know that this old myth is being overturned by professors. Unfortunately, the findings of these professors have not managed to trickle down to the general public yet. This is what we're going to try to do on our series. Let me give you, by the way, an example of a typical story that people have been taught to believe about the Catholic Church, and then consider why it is they so readily believed it when there isn't even a stitch of evidence for it. And here's an example that I think even many people in the viewing audience might have believed, and I myself believed. I have no reason to think otherwise. And that's the idea that Christopher Columbus, when he engaged in his famous voyages, was actually seeking in part to prove that the Earth was not flat, but rather spherical. Now, we've all heard the usual story that Columbus was warned. No, Columbus, no, don't go sailing that far. You're going to fall off the edge of the Earth. Don't you know that? The Earth is a big flat disk, and you're going to fall off the edge and get eaten by dragons, or giant radioactive spiders are going to eat you, something like that. He was warned about all this. Don't do it. Well, he did it anyway, and this goes to show how brave and wonderful he was. Now, I don't dispute that Columbus was indeed a brave and skilled navigator. But Columbus himself, were he here today, would tell you that he was not seeking to prove the Earth was spherical. Why? Because everybody already knew it. Everybody already knew the Earth was a sphere. In effect, no educated person in Europe believed the Earth was flat. That is a myth. That's an almost absurd myth. In fact, just try to go back and find anybody in the history of Christendom who believed in a flat Earth. Just look for them. If everybody believed it, that shouldn't be so hard. And yet you can't find any examples. Well, I correct myself. You can find two examples of people you've never heard of. Lactantius, for example, from the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. He had no influence on anybody, and in any event, he was speaking more allegorically than anything else. The other person who seems to have believed it was a 6th century figure named Cosmas Indicopleustes. You ever heard of him? Neither have I. And neither had anybody in Western Europe. Cosmas wrote in Greek. By the time you get to that period of time, hardly anybody in the West speaks Greek. Pope St. Gregory the Great, for instance, who was Pope from 590 to 604, already he doesn't even speak a word of Greek. So hardly anybody could have read Cosmas. He wasn't translated into Latin until 1706. So anybody who may have taught a flat Earth had an audience of about 1 or 2 people, had no influence on anybody. The fact is, everybody understood the Earth was a sphere. The reason people were reluctant to sponsor Columbus wasn't that they were afraid he was going to fall off the edge. The reason they were afraid to do it was that they thought he had very much underestimated the size of that sphere. Columbus was saying, oh, don't worry about it. It's not a very big Earth. I'll just sail right around. I'll be right back. It'll be fine. But they were saying to him, no, the Earth is several times larger than you think it is, and you're just going to starve to death. You're going to sail, and you're going to sail, and you're going to sail, and you're not going to be any land. Well, luckily for Columbus, a couple of continents managed to spring up, quite contrary to his expectation, and thankfully for him and for his crew. But that was why they didn't want him to go. It wasn't because they thought he was going to fall off the edge. Now, I realize that is so much the opposite of what you've been told. You almost think that I must be making this up, right? I'm sure people believe in a flat Earth, but I promise you they didn't. And there's actually a whole book that was written to answer the obvious follow-up question. If nobody believed in a flat Earth, how did this myth ever get started? And the answer comes in a small book by a guy named Jeffrey Burton Russell. He wrote a book called Inventing the Flat Earth. And what he found was that it was a very, very tiny group of intellectuals in the 19th century who gave birth to this myth. And they did it because it made the Catholic Church look ridiculous. Because it made the Catholic Church look ridiculous. Because in the 19th century, there was a lot of debate and dispute with the Church about Darwin and other matters. And the idea was that if we can portray the Church as being so ridiculous that it used to actually teach the Earth was flat, then we can show that she is an utterly contemptible opponent. So they invented this story to cast the church in an absurd, ridiculous light. I am sure they had no idea the longevity of this myth, that in the 21st century people would still be taught it. I'm sure somewhere in the world right now as I speak, somebody's being taught the stupid church taught the earth was flat and brave, heroic Columbus proved them wrong. It just won't go away. But why won't it go away? Why does it have such staying power? And the reason is that it feeds into this Enlightenment stereotype, right? The Catholic Church is stupid, it inhibits progress, it forces us to believe foolish things. Well, that's exactly what we see in the flat earth myth, isn't it? Who could possibly believe the earth was flat? The ancient Greeks actually measured the circumference of the earth. So obviously they knew it was round. How could the foolish church think anything different? So there's a great example that can easily be overturned. But it hasn't been overturned because it serves a purpose. If you tried to invent some myth today about any famous person you could think of and say that so-and-so believed such and such, it would last for about 3 seconds. But people believe what they are prepared to believe. And people are prepared to believe the worst about the Catholic Church. So the point of the series, the point of the next 12 weeks in which I'll be joining you, is to go after not simply these little myths, but to build up an edifice to show the glories of the Catholic Church. Not simply to say, well, the church didn't really do this, or the church wasn't really so bad over here. We're not going to make any progress if our message is, the Catholic Church, not as bad as you thought. We need something a little more vigorous, little more vigor in our message. We need instead to say, it's not simply the Catholic Church isn't as bad as you thought, or she didn't really teach the earth was flat. We can't win by always running around putting out fires. Nobody ever built a house by putting out fires. Fires have to be put out, it's true. But we understand that we can't build if that's what we're always doing. If we're always letting opponents of the church define the debate for us, then we're always going to be on the defensive. And it seems to me, given the state of our civilization, that it's about time that we went, shall we say, on the offensive. And we showed people all the glories of the church, and we showed them all this hidden history. So we don't have to say, oh, we're not really as bad as you think. We're far more glorious than we ourselves even realize. And we are going to be up against, well, frankly, very, very influential people in this world. I'm sure many of you remember that the European Union's Constitution excludes all mention of the Christian influence on Western civilization. How willfully blind would you have to be, surrounded by cathedrals and religious artwork and the fruits of what the church has given us? How blind would you have to be not to mention that the church had a little something to do with building this civilization? No. Instead, the European Union Constitution begins and ends with the idea that Western civilization, that comes to us from ancient Greece and Rome, and then from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And that 1,000-year period in between, well, I don't know what was going on. Apparently nothing much. That's the standard view, and that was the standard view many people had up until, as I say, as recently as 50 or 100 years ago. But today, any medieval historian worth his salt knows this is a whole lot of nonsense and would reject it with a laugh. But yet, the architects of the European Union exclude mention of the church or of Christ from their founding document. It isn't that they're stupid. If it were just a matter of stupidity, that would be easily overcome. We just come back with the facts and that'll be the end of it. It's that they're hostile to the church. I mean, what could be more obvious than that? Look at what the European Union is up to half the time. Do they seem like pious Catholics, most of these people? They have no interest in spreading the truth about the church. And that's why we as Catholics are under a particular obligation. We have to learn what we can about our faith. And we have to go and spread it. And we have to go and tell people the real history of the Catholic Church, because if we don't defend ourselves, nobody's going to do it for us. I actually wrote a book called How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, because I thought it was about time that we told our story. And that's what I'm going to spend the next 12 episodes doing, is telling our story. But for next time, we're going to start 3 programs on the subject of the church and science. And you're going to have more ammunition then you're going to know what to do with by the time we're done with the next 3 episodes. Because did you know, for instance, that the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, did you know that they were so accomplished in the sciences that right now 35 craters on the moon are named after Jesuit scientists? Did you know that 1 out of 20 of the greatest mathematicians who ever lived belonged to the Society of Jesus? Or that the Jesuits helped to found and then became the greatest practitioners of the study of earthquakes, seismology. And we can go on and on and on. Atomic theory, the study of ancient Egypt, the study of physics, and I can go on and on. There are so many ways in which the Catholic Church contributed to the sciences. So join me next time for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization.